A fitness influencer, obsessed with strength, slapped an old man for ruining his video. He didn't know the quiet veteran was a legendary Marine, and that his son, a high-ranking FBI agent, was 30 minutes away. The morning sun cast a gentle, honeyed glow across the calm waters of Cedar Lake. Inside the Angler's Roost Café, the air smelled of fresh coffee, frying bacon, and the comfortable history of a place that had served the small lakeside town for 50 years. It was here, every Tuesday and Friday, that James Gunny O'Malley came to sit. At 78, Gunny was a man carved from a tougher era. A retired sergeant major from the Marine Corps' elite force reconnaissance, his movements were slow and deliberate, a quiet protest against the arthritis that had settled in his bones. He wore what he always wore, simple work pants, a faded red flannel shirt, and a worn, navy blue cap with the gold and scarlet emblem of the USMC Force Recon barely visible on its front. He greeted the owner, a woman named Sue, with a small, respectful nod and made his way to his usual booth in the corner, a spot that gave him a clear view of both the door and the shimmering lake outside. He was a fixture, a piece of the cafe's soul. His quiet dignity was as much a part of the morning routine as the clatter of plates and the low hum of conversation from the local fishermen and families sharing breakfast. But on this particular Tuesday, a new sound intruded upon the peace. A loud, booming voice that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. "All right, savages. It's Rhino, coming at you live from this rustic little spot. We're about to crush this pancake stack and then crush a new PR at the gym. Let's go." The voice belonged to Rick "Rhino" Johnson. He was a man in his late 20s, built like a cartoon superhero, with bulging muscles straining against a tight, neon yellow tank top that read, "Beast." He had a tripod set up on his table, a high-end smartphone aimed directly at his face as he flexed and preened for his thousands of followers. He was a fitness influencer, a monument to modern narcissism, and he treated the quiet cafe as his personal film set. He complained about the lighting, sent his first coffee back because the foam wasn't aesthetic, and spoke to the waitress with a condescending smirk. Gunny watched him from his corner booth, his expression unreadable, a silent lion observing a loud, strutting peacock. He had seen men like this before, all noise and posture, mistaking muscle for strength and arrogance for confidence. He simply stirred his coffee and looked out at the lake. Rick "Rhino" Johnson was having a problem. His perfect shot of him heroically drizzling syrup onto a mountain of pancakes was being ruined. In the background, visible just over his shoulder, was the old man in the corner booth. The man wasn't doing anything, just sitting there, but his quiet, unimpressed presence was throwing off the vibe. "Hey," Rick said, his voice dripping with forced politeness as he walked over to Gunny's table. "Hey, old-timer. You mind moving? You're kinda killing the shot for me and my followers." Gunny slowly looked up from his coffee, his pale blue eyes meeting Rick's. "I'm fine right here, son," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Rick's smile tightened. He wasn't used to being told no. "Look, it's a bad look, you know. The whole sad, lonely old man thing. It's not the brand. Just shift over to that other table." Gunny took a slow sip of his coffee. "This is my table." The influencer's frustration boiled over. The quiet defiance of the old man was an insult to his self-proclaimed dominance. He saw weakness and it enraged him. "What's with the hat, anyway?" Rick sneered, flicking a finger at the brim of Gunny's cap. "You think that makes you special? That was like 100 years ago. Nobody cares." Gunny didn't flinch. He had faced down men with machine guns in the jungles of Southeast Asia. A boy with a big mouth and bigger muscles was nothing. He simply held Rick's gaze, his silence a wall that the influencer's insults could not penetrate. And that silence was the final trigger. For men like Rick, being ignored is the ultimate act of disrespect. In a flash of puerile rage, he drew back his hand. The motion was shockingly fast. The sound of the slap was like a firecracker exploding in the quiet cafe. It was sharp, ugly, and absolute. Rick's open palm struck Gunny across the side of the head, knocking the worn USMC Force Recon cap from his head. It tumbled through the air and landed face down on the checkered linoleum floor. The entire cafe fell silent. A fork clattered onto a plate. A baby stopped crying. Sue, the owner, froze with a coffee pot in her hand. Everyone stared, their eyes wide with disbelief. Gunny sat perfectly still for a long moment, his cheek glowing red. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed impossible for a man his age, he bent down from his seat. He didn't pick up the hat. He retrieved it, the way a soldier would retrieve a fallen standard. He carefully turned it over in his hands, his thumb gently brushing the dust from the sacred emblem. He then placed it firmly back on his head, adjusting it until it was perfectly straight. He looked up, and his pale blue eyes were no longer just old, they were ancient, filled with a cold, hard light forged in places like Key-san. "Son," Gunny said, his voice devoid of anger, filled only with a chilling certainty. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." He then reached into his flannel shirt pocket, pulled out a simple, old-fashioned flip phone, and dialed a single number from memory. He spoke only a few words, his voice too low for anyone else to hear, before snapping the phone shut and placing it on the table. He then returned to his coffee, as if nothing had happened. The 27 minutes that followed were the longest in the history of the Angler's Roost Café. The air was thick with a tension you could taste. Rick "Rhino" Johnson, his face now flushed with a mixture of adrenaline and dawning apprehension, tried to play it off. He strutted back to his table, muttering about "disrespectful old fools," but his bravado was hollow. He kept glancing nervously at Gunny, who sat with serene, unnerving calm, and then at the door. Several patrons were now discreetly filming with their phones. Sue had her hand on the diner's wall-mounted telephone, her eyes locked on Rick, ready to call the sheriff. Then, they came. There was no sound of sirens, no roar of engines. Just a silent, coordinated arrival. 6 black, immaculate Chevrolet Suburbans glided to a stop in the cafe's parking lot, their tinted windows reflecting the placid lake. They moved with a predatory grace, forming a silent, intimidating semicircle around Rick's ridiculously oversized, custom-wrapped pickup truck. The doors of the Suburbans opened in unison. A dozen men stepped out. They were not soldiers in camouflage. They were men in functional civilian clothes, polos, slacks, tactical boots, with dark ballistic vests strapped to their chests. On the front and back of each vest, in bold, yellow letters, were 3 words, FBI. They didn't speak or shout. They moved with a quiet, fluid efficiency, establishing a perimeter around the cafe. They were professional, impassive, and more terrifying than any shouting biker gang could ever be. From the lead vehicle stepped a man who was clearly in charge. He was around 50, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark gray suit that did little to hide the powerful, athletic frame beneath it. He had his father's square jaw and a full head of dark, neatly cut hair. His eyes, however, were different. They weren't the eyes of a warrior, they were the cold, analytical eyes of a hunter. This was Special Agent in Charge Michael O'Malley of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He adjusted his tie and walked towards the entrance of the cafe, his team parting silently to let him pass. The age of muscle was over. The age of consequence had arrived. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly as Michael O'Malley stepped inside. The low murmur of conversation ceased instantly. The patrons, who had been whispering and staring at Rick, now stared at Michael. He ignored them all. His eyes scanned the room and found his father, still sitting calmly in the corner booth. He walked directly to the table, the crowd parting for him as if by an invisible force. He didn't salute, the FBI are civilians, but instead, placed a firm, steady hand on his father's shoulder. It was a gesture of profound respect, a transmission of strength and support. "Dad," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Mike," Gunny answered, looking up at his son. Just a little disruption. Michael's jaw tightened. He straightened up and turned his cold, analytical gaze upon Rick "Rhino" Johnson. The influencer, who had built a career and an identity on projecting an image of alpha male dominance, seemed to shrink in his chair. The muscles, the tattoos, the neon tank top, it all looked absurdly childish now. "You," Michael said. The word was not a question, it was an indictment. "You put your hands on him." Rick stammered, his bravado completely evaporated. He was in my shot. He was disrespecting me." Michael took a slow step closer. "Disrespect," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Let me tell you about disrespect. You film yourself lifting weights in an air-conditioned gym. My father humped a 60-pound pack through jungles so dense the sun never touched the ground. You complain when your coffee is cold. He drank water from muddy footprints to stay alive. You call yourself a beast because you can lift a metal bar. This man, this old-timer, survived the 77-day siege of Khe Sanh, one of the most brutal battles in the history of the Marine Corps. He was standing directly in front of Rick's table now, his shadow falling over the influencer. My father's calluses have more honor than your entire body. His silence has more strength than your loudest grunt. You didn't just assault an old man who couldn't fight back. You assaulted a legacy. You spat on the memory of every man who fought beside him, every friend he watched die. You put your hands on a piece of American history." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the dead silent room. "Now," Michael said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You are going to stand up. You are going to walk over to his table. And you are going to apologize. Not because he needs to hear it, but because you need to say it." Trembling, Rick pushed his chair back and stood. He shuffled over to Gunny's booth like a man walking to his own execution. He mumbled a pathetic, barely audible apology. "Shake his hand," Michael commanded. Rick extended a shaking hand. Gunny looked at it for a long moment before finally taking it. His grip was surprisingly firm, his old eyes locking onto Rick's, imparting one final, silent lesson about what true strength felt like. Rick snatched his hand back as if burned and, without another word, scrambled out of the cafe, past the silent FBI agents, and fled. The video filmed by the other patrons became an internet phenomenon overnight. It wasn't just a viral clip, it was a cultural moment. The story of the arrogant influencer and the quiet Marine veteran became a parable for the modern age. Rick "Rhino" Johnson's online empire crumbled in a matter of days as sponsors dropped him and followers deserted him in droves. He was, in the parlance of his own world, cancelled. Gunny O'Malley, however, remained unchanged. He politely declined every interview request and continued his bi-weekly visits to the Angler's Roost Café, where Sue now refused to ever let him pay for his coffee. He was a local hero, but he carried the title with the same quiet humility with which he had carried everything else in his life. A few months later, a new scholarship fund was announced for the children of fallen Marines from Force Reconnaissance Units. It was established by SAC Michael O'Malley in honor of his father, Sergeant Major James "Gunny" O'Malley. The fund was started with a single, very large, and completely anonymous donation. The incident at the cafe was never about revenge. It was about remembrance. It served as a stark reminder that true strength isn't measured by the size of one's muscles or the volume of one's voice, but by the quiet resilience of the human spirit and the honor earned through a lifetime of sacrifice. It's a strength that doesn't tear others down, but builds a lasting legacy for others to stand upon. What does true strength mean to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's remember to honor the quiet heroes who walk among us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that inspire.